Wes, thanks so much for joining us and sharing a little bit about the book of Galatians. We've just started a series, an 8-week series in the book. And Wes, you're an absolute gun in New Testament and New Testament Greek and Galatians and everything like that. Do you mind just introducing yourself and giving us a bit of your history with the book of Galatians?
Sure, Michael. I've been a Presbyterian minister for 40 years now. Um, I had a fair bit of pastoral time in pastorate, and I've been lecturing at theological college for uh, 27 years now, actually nearly 30 if I take some part-time into account. I did my PhD in the book of Galatians, and I did my 70,000 word master's thesis in the book of Galatians. So I've spent a bit of time there and taught it regularly at college over the years.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're in great hands here. So Wes, who wrote the letter and when?
The Apostle Paul wrote the letter. It's actually disputed when he wrote it. Um, I think most New Testament scholarship now would agree that he wrote it um, just before the Council of Jerusalem, which basically, if you look at the book of Acts, it fits between chapter 14 and chapter 15. And that's because most scholarship would agree that Galatia is the Roman province of Galatia, which includes all the towns in Acts 13, 14 that Paul visited on his first missionary journey. So he went on his first missionary journey in chapters 13 and 14 of Acts. Then he wrote the letter, and then we have the Council of Jerusalem.
Yeah, fantastic. So Wes, what are the main kind of themes of the book of Galatians? What sort of things is Paul addressing?
Yeah, it's an interesting letter because in the themes that he addresses, he really reveals how much he is a pastor and a theologian at the same time, which are always two things that are very good to go together. Um, in the Because there's a theological issue and a social pastoral issue that he's addressing both of. Now, the main and like a good pastor, he's aware that the underlying all pastoral social issues is really a God to man theological issue. Now, the God man theological issue the church was facing is the issue of how does one be right with God? Or, in other words, how does one be righteous? Or, in terms of God as judge, how does one find themselves justified, declared innocent by the judge? That's the theological issue. Are we right with God by believing in Jesus? Or are we right with God by, in their situation, keeping Jewish laws? Or how that translates to us by doing good things. So really it's how we're right with God, by believing in Jesus or doing good things or keeping God's law. That's the theological issue. They're only there a few times, but embedded into the letter are references to persecution. And the key one is in chapter 6, verse 12, right at the end. Do you want me to read that, Michael?
Yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah, where he says, I'll read verse 12. It is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who would force you to be circumcised, in other words, compel you to keep Jewish law. And then he says, and only in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. So what he's saying here is the people who are pushing the false gospel that you're right with God by keeping Jewish law, they're saying they're doing that because they want you to be right with God, but he's saying their real reason is they want to avoid persecution. And all through, and in three separate
Yeah, right.
places in the gospel, we see references to persecution. So the theological issue is how are we right with God? But the social issue is if we deny the true gospel, will avoid persecution.
So I guess that kind of segues right into our next question because I don't think, well, I don't experience any Judaizers trying to get me circumcised here in the first century. Um, but what does the letter have to say to God's church here today?
Yeah. My pastoral experience shows me that the people I know who've turned away from the true gospel, justification by faith, and have turned away to some alternate gospel, they've rarely done it for what I would call purely a theological reason. They've sat down and looked at the theology and decided to abandon justification by faith and go to another reason. My pastoral experience is most people who abandon the gospel do it because um, they don't like the bad gospel, or they want to pursue some other more socially acceptable or pleasurable pathway. And so what Paul is, it's the same for them as for us. We are tempted by so many ideas to be politically correct,
Mm,
to be socially acceptable, to avoid persecution, to avoid ridicule in our context for being a Christian, or just be accepted for being more open.
mm,
People leave the gospel for social reasons. And Paul is saying, no, there is a good reason to stay firm. In our context, it's not to avoid outright persecution, but in our context, the same situation is there. If we stick with the gospel, we're not always socially, politically acceptable. But Paul is saying, no, there is a good reason to stay with the gospel. And the good reason is the gospel itself. So his reason for staying with the gospel is because
mm,
that is the only way to be right with God. And that is the only way to be following truth
mm,
and what is right is to stick with the gospel. So we are we have the true gospel, we have alternate gospels, and the reason for staying with the true gospel for us is because the true gospel is the true gospel. And it's the only way to be right with God. Remember back a little bit a while ago, I said Paul showed himself as a
yes.
true pastor, and behind all social issues is a theological issue. Temptations to abandon the gospel and compromise are really a theological issue. They may look like a social issue to avoid persecution or ridicule, but at heart, they are a theological issue. We're not believing the gospel, we're not trusting the gospel,
Mm.
or we're being disobedient to the gospel.
Fantastic. Well, Wes, thank you so much for your time with us today, and we look forward to getting more into the book.
Yes, I hope you and your church together have a great time going through the book of Galatians. Thanks, Michael.